I never imagined the day would come when my own children would look at me and I would feel invisible. I had spent years building this family, nurturing it with patience, love, and small sacrifices I barely even noticed at the time. I believed love was enough, that time spent together, shared meals, laughter, and even disagreements would create a bond that nothing could break. But one morning, everything changed. It was subtle at first, a glance that lingered too long on a phone, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a gentle hello that felt hollow. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Mothers do that, don't we? We feel a shift before anyone else does, reading signs that might not even exist. Then came the day when my daughter-in-law told me to leave. She said it calmly, without yelling, without anger. Her words were clear, precise. It's time for you to go. You don't belong here anymore. I smiled. I don't know why I smiled. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was because I had learned, somewhere deep inside, that tears wouldn't help. Smiling became my shield, my quiet protest. I walked to my room, slowly, carrying the weight of years spent raising a family, the countless small moments no one ever noticed, the love that had been quietly building and quietly ignored. That day, I understood the fragility of relationships, even the ones we think are unbreakable. Love, I realized, is not always returned in the measure we give it. Sometimes, it is overlooked, taken for granted, and left to fade into silence. I sat by my window that evening, the sun setting slowly, spilling soft light across the empty living room. Everything looked familiar, yet different. Shadows stretched across the furniture, turning the ordinary into something almost sacred in its quiet stillness. I realized then that the hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was the feeling of invisibility, the silent ache of a heart that had loved fully and yet felt unseen. Our home had always been lively. Even in small moments, there was warmth. The smell of breakfast filling the kitchen in the early morning, the sound of laughter spilling from the living room, voices overlapping in chaos and joy. I remember mornings when my son, Armin, would rush in with messy hair, chattering about dreams I only partially understood, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, and my daughter-in-law, Sarah, bright and full of life, always smiling politely. Sometimes shy, sometimes bold, always observing the family patterns before stepping fully into them. We had celebrated birthdays with laughter and cake, decorated rooms with balloons, and sometimes, in quiet corners, I would watch my children from afar, not because I didn't participate, but because I wanted to savor their joy quietly. There is a certain magic in simply observing the people you love, knowing that they are happy and that the home you've created has held them safely for years. But as time passed, subtle shifts began, small things at first, a glance that lingered on a phone, a delayed response to a question, a laugh shared with someone else that didn't include me. These were minor at first, easy to dismiss, and yet, over weeks and months, they accumulated like invisible cracks in a wall. I noticed the small distances growing, unspoken and delicate, but unmistakable. I tried to remind myself of the past, the evenings spent reading stories to Armin, the way he would cling to my hand while walking through the park, the quiet reassurance in Sarah's voice when she first entered the family. I told myself that love is patient, love is enduring. These words were repeated in my mind, like a mantra against fear, against sadness, against the creeping sense of being left behind. Still, the evenings began to feel longer, the house, quieter. I found myself sitting with a cup of tea, listening to the soft hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog outside, and feeling the emptiness settle in corners that had once been filled with laughter. I began keeping a small journal, writing letters I never sent, pouring my heart onto pages no one would read. It was my way of coping, of acknowledging the quiet ache without disturbing anyone else. Even small acts of love, unnoticed, became my solace. I would tidy the kitchen before anyone saw it. I would prepare breakfast just the way Armin liked it. Sometimes, I would leave small notes on his plate, tiny reminders that someone cared, even when no one asked for it. These acts felt both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because I was still giving love, heartbreaking because it seemed it might never be returned. Over time, I noticed that the distance wasn't just a matter of chance. It had become a rhythm in the household, subtle but steady. Sarah would prepare meals, talk to Armin, involve herself in family decisions, and I would find myself standing slightly aside, offering suggestions that were sometimes acknowledged politely but never acted upon. Conversations became shorter, exchanges more formal. The warmth I had always relied upon was dimming, replaced with an uneasy calm. I remember a morning vividly. The sunlight was soft, spilling across the dining table. I placed Armin's favorite cereal in front of him, carefully toasted the bread, poured juice into a small glass. I smiled, hoping for a spark of recognition, a fleeting thank you, anything. He looked at me, nodded, and returned to his phone. No words, no glance, just polite acknowledgement. It was then I realized the first deep truth. Love alone cannot force connection. Patience alone cannot guarantee recognition. Years of dedication, of quiet sacrifice, of nurturing love, they are not always enough. After that morning, the rhythm of our home changed. I began noticing things I had overlooked before. The way Armand lingered in the hallway just a little too long, avoiding eye contact. The way Sarah would ask me questions, not for answers, but almost as if testing me, observing whether I would respond in the right way. It started with small, almost imperceptible moments. The way my suggestions for meals were met with polite nods but no action. The way the living room, once a place of shared laughter, had become a quiet room where everyone sat on their own, immersed in phones, laptops, or silent thoughts. I would smile, offer conversation, try to laugh at a joke, and yet the responses were minimal. I felt the invisible barrier growing stronger, but I kept reminding myself, patience, love, quiet endurance. One afternoon, I was washing dishes when Sarah walked in. She leaned against the doorway and said softly, "Mom, could you give us some space? Armin and I need time to figure things out." I stopped, holding a plate in my hands. Space. What do you mean? She hesitated, looking away. "We just need our time alone. You know, as a couple." I nodded slowly, forcing calm into my voice. "Of course, I understand." But inside, my chest ached. Every word felt like a small stone dropped into my heart. I realized that my presence, once natural and accepted, had become something inconvenient. The warmth I had always assumed was mutual now felt conditional, fragile, easily broken. Days turned into weeks. I tried to adjust quietly. I stayed in my room longer, walked slower in the hallways to avoid interrupting their conversations, kept my voice softer, my presence less noticeable. I reminded myself that love was patient, but patience can feel lonely when it is unacknowledged. I noticed the subtle changes in Armand too, the way he would barely speak in the mornings, a short nod instead of the chatter we had once shared, the way he would brush past me, hands full of bags, barely glancing. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't display anger, just a quiet, consistent distance, and somehow, that was worse than confrontation. It was a slow erosion, a soft separation I could neither explain nor stop. One evening, I found him sitting at the table, staring at his phone. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked over. "How was your day?" I asked gently, hoping for some small connection. "Fine," he replied, not looking up. That one word, so ordinary, so minimal, was enough to remind me that the bond I had always assumed was unbreakable was now fragile. I forced a smile and sat across from him, pretending that everything was normal. Inside, I felt a quiet hollow opening up, but I told myself, this too shall pass. The tension wasn't just with Armand. Sarah's subtle criticisms began to appear more often. The way she would comment on how I cooked, the way she suggested changes to my routines, the way she organized the house without asking for my input. I reminded myself that it was their home to now, their rules too. But each comment, each adjustment, chipped away at the comfort I had felt in my own space. I began keeping a journal more diligently, writing letters I never sent. Sometimes I read them back to myself, whispering words I longed to say aloud. "I am here. I love you. I will always care for you." It was a quiet ritual, a way to maintain my dignity while facing the slow, invisible drift away from the family I had nurtured for decades. And then came the day of the small argument, a seemingly minor incident that felt enormous in the quiet distance between us. Armin had left a cup on the counter. I moved it, quietly, as I always did. Sarah saw me and said sharply, "Mom, can you just leave it? It's not a big deal." I froze for a moment. The cup, a cup on the counter. Such a simple, ordinary thing. And yet, the sharpness of her tone, the dismissiveness in her eyes, felt like a small avalanche. I nodded, holding back words I knew would escalate nothing. I realized that our home once a place of shared care and consideration, had become a place of careful navigation where one misstep could be misinterpreted, where even small acts of love were scrutinized, questioned, or rejected. The evenings became hardest. I would sit alone, the faint hum of the television filling the empty spaces where laughter once lived. I would glance at the family photo on the wall. Armin, as a child, his small hand in mine, Sarah smiling beside him. I would imagine the past, when love felt effortless, easy, abundant, and I would feel the quiet sting of absence not in presence, but in acknowledgement. One rainy afternoon, I decided to tidy the garden, hoping to distract myself. I worked slowly, hands in the soil, whispering encouragement to the tiny shoots. It was a habit I had loved for years, a meditation in quiet labor. Yet, even as I pruned and watered, I felt the distance between myself and the family inside the house. They were living together, yet I was an observer. My presence had become optional, a part of the scenery rather than an integral part of life. Sometimes, I would hear Armin laugh at something I did not understand, Sarah responding with her familiar, polite warmth, but that warmth was not for me. It existed in a space I no longer occupied. The slow, quiet realization sank in. Love alone cannot command attention, and patience alone cannot reclaim hearts that have begun to drift. I tried talking to Armin that evening. "Do you want some tea?" I asked softly. "No, thanks," he said, barely glancing up. I nodded, forcing a smile, and walked away. I realized then that my attempts at connection, my gentle gestures, might not be enough. That love, no matter how patient, could not bridge every gap, especially when others' priorities shifted. The days seemed to stretch longer, each one echoing with the quiet hum of what was missing. I would wake early, the house still wrapped in the soft gray of dawn, the faint smell of rain on the grass mixed with the lingering warmth of the kitchen from last night's tea. I moved quietly through the rooms, careful not to disturb the fragile calm, and began preparing breakfast, in the hope of catching Armin's attention, of sharing a smile, of feeling even a flicker of the warmth we had once shared. But more often than not, he was already gone. I would hear the faint creak of the front door opening and closing, the soft hum of his car starting in the driveway, and then the house would settle back into silence. Only the faint scent of his coffee lingered, along with the ghost of a greeting I would never hear. Each day, the absence of acknowledgement built a quiet heaviness in my chest, the kind that presses down without dramatic force but leaves an ache that settles into your bones. Sarah's presence grew more pronounced, though never harsh. She moved through the house with quiet authority, rearranging furniture, placing new kitchen tools on the counters, adjusting lighting in the evenings. Everything had been done with subtle efficiency, but it left me feeling like a guest in my own home. I began to notice how little my presence mattered in decisions that I had once made without a thought: the placement of chairs, the choice of curtains, even the tone of our evening conversations. I tried not to let it show, tried to keep my voice calm, my movements deliberate, my smile steady. Yet, beneath the quiet exterior, a storm brewed, a slow, insistent ache that whispered each time my gestures were ignored, each time my words faded into polite nods or averted glances. One evening, I set the table for dinner. It was simple: soup, fresh bread, and a small salad. I moved each plate and cup with care, imagining the familiar rhythm of family meals from the past. When Armin walked in, he smiled politely, a brief, almost automatic curve of his lips, and went straight to his phone. "Dinner's ready," I said softly, my voice almost trembling despite my calm. He glanced up, nodded, and continued scrolling. Sarah sat across from him, sipping her drink, glancing at me only briefly, her small polite smile carrying no warmth, only acknowledgement. It was enough to make the table feel foreign, a stage where I existed but was not truly part of the story. I forced myself to eat quietly, taking small bites, pretending the ache in my chest was simply hunger, trying to hold back the rising tide of sorrow. I remembered the evenings of the past, the laughter over burnt cookies, the spilled milk that turned into jokes, the conversations that stretched late into the night over trivial things yet felt profound in their intimacy. Now, the table felt like a border I was no longer allowed to cross. Every gesture, every question, seemed to be filtered through a lens that rendered me optional. My presence muted and softened until it almost disappeared entirely. I tried to speak, to bridge the distance. "How was work?" I asked, my words gentle, tentative, hoping for just a spark of connection. "It was fine," Armin replied. voice steady but distant, as though his words were delivered from another room entirely, even though he sat right there, just fine. I pressed softly, hoping he would linger, expand, share, as he once had. Yes, he said, and returned to his phone. His attention pulled elsewhere. My throat tightened, my chest ached, and I nodded quietly. Swallowing the lump that had formed there, I felt a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. I wanted to be proud of the man Armand had become, capable, independent, polite, but alongside that pride was grief. The boy who had once shared his dreams, his fears, his entire small world with me, was now almost a stranger. His life, his laughter, his stories, everything existed just out of reach. Like sunlight reflected on a window I could see but never touch. The next morning, I left a note for Armand. Simple words, carefully written. I love you. I hope you had a good night's sleep. I placed it on the counter, folded neatly so he would see it. Hours later, I found it untouched, folded back into a corner as if it had never existed. The act was small, almost invisible, yet it mattered to me. And when it went unnoticed, the realization was profound. My presence, my love, my careful attention had become invisible. It was not a rejection delivered with harsh words, but the quiet, subtle kind, the kind that creeps into your bones and whispers that you are no longer seen. I wondered if I had done something wrong, if I had failed to maintain the bond, or if life simply moved too fast for hearts to keep pace. I began noticing other small signs, like pieces of a puzzle that I could not fully assemble. Armand and Sarah would whisper quietly in the evenings, speaking in tones just above my hearing. They would laugh softly at private jokes, glance at each other, and include me only in passing gestures. Decisions were made without my input, from small things like what movie to watch, to larger matters like weekend plans or household schedules. My suggestions, once welcomed and valued, were now politely declined or ignored entirely. One evening, I tried to join a conversation about a movie they were planning to watch. I remember that one, I said softly. I think it was on when Armand was a kid. He loved it. Armand glanced at me for a brief second. Yep, thanks, Mom, he said, his voice polite, almost clipped, and returned to his conversation with Sarah. I nodded quietly and left the room, carrying the invisible weight of exclusion with me. My memories, my shared history, seemed no longer to matter, as if they had been archived in a life I could no longer touch. The loneliness grew heavier in the evenings. I would sit in the quiet living room, listening to rain tapping softly against the windows. Sometimes, I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the house envelop me, the faint creak of the floors, the distant hum of appliances, the whisper of the wind outside. I thought about the past. Armand, as a toddler, his small hand in mine, the evenings spent reading stories, the laughter we shared over spilled juice or mismatched socks, and I wondered if he remembered those moments at all, or if they had faded into the current tide of his life. Even pride brought its own sorrow. I wanted to celebrate the man Armand had become, to honor his independence and maturity, yet each small act of exclusion reminded me that my place in his life had become precarious, conditional, and sometimes invisible. I began keeping busy with small tasks, laundry, gardening, cleaning, anything to make my presence purposeful, to assert my existence in the household without confrontation. But even as I worked, a quiet hollow persisted. Each sweep of the broom, each folded shirt, each pot washed felt like a whisper into the void. One afternoon, Armand and Sarah left for a short trip. The house, suddenly too large, too empty, felt alien. I wandered from room to room, touching the familiar furniture, breathing in the lingering sense of home, and yet feeling as though I were walking through someone else's life. I sat by the window, tea in hand, watching the rain slide down the glass. My reflection stared back at me, tired, quiet eyes, holding sorrow but hiding the depth of it behind a practiced calm. That it was in that moment, alone with my thoughts, that I realized something crucial. I had been pretending I was fine. I had been relying on patience and love to maintain the bond, hoping they would naturally sustain it. But pretending is not enough. Quiet endurance cannot replace acknowledgement. Connection cannot survive without recognition. And so, for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel the loneliness fully. I let the tears fall freely, tracing quiet lines down my cheeks, unchecked, unjudged, unobserved. That night, I wrote in my journal, I am here, I love them, and even if they do not notice, I cannot stop loving. But I must also honor my own heart, my own need for presence and care. the rising conflict continued, not in loud arguments, not in dramatic confrontations, but in subtle, everyday moments. Every polite nod, every ignored question, every conversation that continued without me layered a quiet ache into my heart. An almost imperceptible tension that grew steadily. The distance was not visible to outsiders, but to me, it was palpable. A shadow cast over every interaction, a weight I carried silently. I realized then that this was not a battle to be won with words, or a confrontation solved by explanation. This was a test of patience, a lesson in quiet endurance, and a challenge to maintain dignity amidst subtle neglect. I could not force them to include me. I could not command their attention, affection, or recognition. All I could do was remain present, continue to love, and hold on to my own integrity even as my place felt uncertain. And so, the days rolled on. The house remained full of activity, yet my presence was softly peripheral. I existed in the background, a quiet observer of the life I had once been at the center of. Yet, even in this shadow, I began to notice moments of potential connection, glances that lingered too long to be accidental, smiles offered quietly, an occasional question seeking my opinion. These moments, fleeting as they were, became a lifeline, small sparks that reminded me to continue hoping, to continue loving, and to continue existing fully, even when UMA2nd LWLEDGED. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of morning that seems to hold its breath, as if the world itself is waiting for something to happen. I had planned a small breakfast, simple but thoughtful pancakes, lightly browned, slices of fresh fruit arranged in a pattern that I thought would make Armand smile, and a steaming cup of tea, its aroma curling gently into the air. I imagined the two of us sitting together at the table, exchanging a few words, sharing a moment before the day began. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, spilling golden light onto the floor, glinting off the teacup, warming the room in soft hues that reminded me of early mornings from years past. I set everything on the table with care, each pancake carefully stacked, each piece of fruit placed just so, my hands moving almost automatically, guided by years of habit, by the knowledge of what had once brought warmth and laughter to this space. I could hear birds outside, their soft chatter punctuating the quiet of the house. It was ordinary, domestic, familiar, and, yet, that ordinary feeling had begun to feel fragile, precarious. When Armand came into the kitchen, it wasn't alone. Sarah was there with him, laughing softly, their heads close together, voices mingling in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller, almost crowded. I stepped forward, my lips parting in a gentle greeting. "Breakfast smells good," I said, softly, trying to make my voice steady, trying to invite him into the morning we had once shared. "Thanks," he murmured, his eyes not lifting from the cup of coffee he held, his voice distant, polite, yet devoid of the warmth I had expected. I felt an ache settle deep into my chest, one that I could not name at first, a hollow pressure that made my ribs feel tight and my heart heavy. They sat, side by side, sharing smiles and quiet jokes that I could not understand. I laughed when I could, but it was an automatic response, a rehearsal for a role I no longer fully belonged to. I realized, in that instant, that my presence had become optional, almost irrelevant. The home I had spent decades nurturing, the kitchen where he had once rushed in with messy hair and sleepy eyes, had shifted. My place in it had shifted too quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, until it became undeniable. After breakfast, Sarah suggested we all go for a walk in the neighborhood. I followed, quietly, hoping to be part of the conversation, to hear my son's voice directed at me again, even for just a moment. But each joke, each story, each smile, was shared exclusively between them. I tried to interject, to contribute, but my words seemed to dissolve in the space between us. I laughed when I could, but it felt like practicing a performance in someone else's play, a polite observer in a scene that I had once starred in. I watched Armand's hand brush against Sarah's casually, the kind of small, intimate gesture that spoke volumes, and felt a quiet, invisible pull in my chest, a reminder that his attention had shifted, that the central place I had held in his life was no longer mine. Later, as the afternoon light softened, Armand called me into the living room. My mind raced with anticipation, half hoping for a simple conversation, a shared memory, a small gesture of acknowledgement. But the moment I entered, the atmosphere shifted. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, her posture deliberate, her expression calm but firm. Her presence carried a weight I had not expected, and my heart, already tender from the morning, began to sink. "Mom," she said, her voice measured, polite, almost rehearsed, "we need to talk about something important." I nodded, feeling a twist in my stomach, a quiet unease that had been creeping in for weeks now. Armin remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands fidgeting lightly. I felt the air between us thicken. Sarah continued, her words steady, almost gentle, but each one struck me like a stone falling onto my chest. "We've been thinking, and we believe it's best if you find another place to stay, somewhere closer to the city, where you can have more independence." The words landed slowly, at first in fragments I could barely comprehend. "Another place," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You mean, leave here?" "Yes," she said softly, almost apologetically. "We just think it will be easier for everyone, for you, for us. It's nothing personal." I blinked, trying to process the meaning of what had been said. I could feel tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. My mind ran through decades of memories: birthdays, school, projects, late-night talks, laughter, tears, shared struggles, and milestones. All of it suddenly measured against this gentle suggestion of my absence, as though my life, my love, and my presence could be neatly repackaged and moved somewhere else, without fuss or drama. I looked at Armand, hoping for a spark of recognition, a word, a glance that would remind me of the bond we had shared, but his eyes stayed downcast. His silence was heavier than any words. In that moment, I felt both invisible and weighty, like I existed in the same space as them but was no longer a part of their world. I smiled instead, a small, fragile smile that felt almost instinctive, a shield against the ache within. "I see," I whispered quietly, trying to steady my voice. "I understand." Inside, though, something cracked, not a sudden burst of anger, but a quiet, gnawing despair that had been accumulating for years. Pretending to be fine, to endure, to keep showing up, had reached its limit. The loneliness I had carried, the subtle pain of exclusion, had gathered enough weight to press down on me in one concentrated moment. That evening, I sat alone in my room. The walls, once filled with laughter and photographs of milestones, seemed to close in around me. I held my journal on my lap, fingers trembling slightly, and wrote, "I am still here. I still love them. But my heart aches in ways I cannot explain. I am invisible in my own home." The night stretched endlessly. Sleep refused to come. I replayed the conversation over and over, examining each word, each pause, each deliberate inflection. I asked myself, had I missed something? Had I been blind to the signs? Had I failed as a mother? I thought of the mornings I had made pancakes, the afternoons spent listening to his stories, the evenings tucked at his bedside while he slept. I recalled our small rituals, the shared tea, the quiet laughter, the smiles that once needed no context. They had been acts of love, gestures meant to anchor us, to build a home together. And yet, here I was, realizing that love alone was sometimes not enough. Recognition was necessary, acknowledgement, presence, something I had long taken for granted, now withheld or redirected. The next morning, the house felt both familiar and alien. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces I had known for decades: the worn armchair that had molded to my son's frame, the kitchen counter with faint stains from our shared cooking experiments, the rug in the hallway worn smooth from countless footsteps. Everything was the same, yet nothing felt the same. I could still smell the faint aroma of breakfast from the day before, but it no longer carried warmth. It carried absence, a quiet reminder that life was moving forward, and I was not at the center of it anymore. I began to pack my belongings. Small things at first: books, personal mementos, photos. Each item carried memories. Each memory brought a pang of sorrow. I paused frequently, holding a photograph of Armin as a toddler, a memory of his first day at school, a note he had left me once that simply said, "I love you, Mom." I whispered soft goodbyes to each object. "Thank you," I murmured. "Thank you for holding our moments, our memories." As I packed, I felt grief settled into me, not loud or dramatic, but subtle and persistent. Each folded shirt, each carefully placed book, each box taped shut, was a reminder of the life I had built here, now being gently dismantled. I realized that the pain was not just about leaving a home, but about losing the central role I had played in my son's life. Yet, even in this sorrow, there was a spark of resilience. I reminded myself that love is not only about being present, but also about enduring even when unacknowledged. I could carry my heart with dignity, even in quiet exclusion. I could continue loving without expectation. That day, the turning point crystallized, not through dramatic confrontation or tears of anger, but through quiet acknowledgement. The life I had built, the home I had nurtured, had shifted, and I knew, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that moving forward would require a new kind of courage, the courage to face solitude, to continue loving without recognition, and to reclaim my sense of self. I paused by the window, watching the world outside, the neighbors walking their dogs, children playing, the sunlight dancing on leaves. Life moved on, relentless, beautiful, and indifferent. I drew a deep breath, feeling the quiet weight of change, and whispered to myself, I am still here. I am still strong. I will carry my love, no matter what. And with that, I turned back to the boxers, the packed memories, the quiet ache in my chest, and began the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming myself in the midst of loss. The days that followed blurred into a strange, quiet rhythm that was difficult to name. The mornings were emptier than I had ever imagined, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside the window to keep me company. Even the sunlight felt different, filtering in with a diffused gentleness that could not warm the growing emptiness I felt. Armin and Sarah moved through the house with an ease that reminded me of a world I was no longer central to. They greeted me politely, yet their words felt rehearsed, distant, as if I were a guest passing through a place I once called home. I tried to engage, to maintain a presence in the life I had shared with my son, but every small attempt felt fleeting and easily overlooked. I washed dishes, making sure to place each cup and plate neatly. I poured tea, arranging the cups as I had always done, hoping to spark conversation, perhaps a smile, a laugh. Sometimes, I would ask a question, casually, about his day, or a memory we shared, but the response was always a polite nod, a murmured thanks, or a brief glance that carried no warmth. It was not confrontation that stunk, it was absence. The absence of acknowledgement, of recognition, of a bond that once seemed unshakable. The polite distance was a quiet thief, stealing from me a sense of belonging that I had taken for granted. There were no loud words, no harsh disagreements, just the subtle way they moved through the house, together, without me. I felt like a shadow, present but unnoticed, occupying rooms that once held laughter, now filled with silence. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the small, sunlit corner of the living room, I heard them laughing softly in the other room. The sound was effortless, the kind of laughter that comes from comfort and closeness, yet it carried an invisible weight. It reminded me of intimacy and belonging, things I had once shared so freely with Armand. I paused, the shirt slipping from my hands. The warmth I had felt in the fabric was replaced by a cold ache that settled deep into my chest, as if a small stone had been placed there, pressing me down. I retreated to the small room that had once been my sanctuary, the one I had filled with photos, memories, and the quiet accumulation of a lifetime of love. The walls were lined with pictures from birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that had once felt extraordinary. Armand as a boy, laughing in the kitchen with flour on his cheeks. Quiet afternoons spent reading together on the couch, soft tea in mismatched cups, shared words exchanged with laughter and ease. Now, these memories felt fragile, almost brittle. They reminded me of love I had given freely, love that existed in a past that seemed inaccessible. I turned to my journal more often. My entries became raw, longer, less polished. The pages carried the quiet grief of being present but invisible. I wrote without thought of style, letting the words flow from my heart as though they might relieve even a fraction of the loneliness that had settled inside me. I am still here. I still care. I still love, but they barely see me. I am invisible in my own home, and yet I will endure. The evenings were the hardest. The house, bathed in soft lamplight or the golden glow of sunset, felt vast and quiet. I would sit by the window, watching the neighbors walk past, children playing with abandon, couples holding hands, families laughing together. Life outside moved with natural ease, and I felt both connected and apart, as though I were peering through glass into a world I could no longer fully inhabit. Then, one evening, a moment arrived that broke the dull routine. Armin entered my room, steps hesitant, almost unsure. He paused at the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. His eyes searched mine, flickering with something unspoken. I could see hesitation, a quiet memory perhaps, and even a trace of guilt. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked quietly, almost vulnerably. I nodded, setting my book aside, hands clammy, heart racing. I did not know what to expect. Would he apologize? Explain? Would this be a genuine connection, or just a gesture that would fade as quickly as it had appeared? He moved closer, voice low, almost fragile. "I didn't realize how much space I was taking with Sarah, how much I was leaving you out." The words struck me like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. Not a dramatic apology, not a loud confession, just a quiet acknowledgement of absence, a recognition of pain. I felt tears prick at the edges of my eyes, but held them back, unsure if I should let them fall. "I'm sorry," he continued softly, more to himself than to me. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just got caught up, I guess." Months of quiet neglect weighed heavily on me, making speech difficult. The ache in my chest was raw, yet there was a strange warmth in hearing his words. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. The warmth of his familiar skin brought a fragile comfort, and I whispered, "I know, I understand." We sat in silence for a long moment, not uncomfortable, not awkward, simply a shared presence that held both pain and hope. That small acknowledgement, that fragile apology, was a bridge over months of distance. It was delicate, yet real. The next few days unfolded in tentative, careful steps. Conversations were cautious, full of hesitations and pauses. We shared cups of tea that were no longer solitary rituals. There were smiles that felt genuine, laughter that returned slowly, quietly. I learned to breathe again, to find warmth in the smallest gestures, to see that love could persist even when delayed. Every day, I noticed small changes. Armin lingered in the kitchen longer, glanced toward me with something I could not name but recognized: attention, care, warmth. He began asking small questions, sharing minor decisions, including me in a way that felt deliberate, yet not forced. Sarah softened too. Her voice carried less authority, more gentleness. Her laughter, once sharp and exclusive, became inclusive. She moved around the house differently, as though she were adjusting, learning the rhythm that had been interrupted. Yet the loneliness did not vanish entirely. It lingered, a soft, persistent ache that reminded me to treasure connection, to value acknowledgement, to continue offering love, even when it seemed invisible. There were moments, small and fleeting, when I would sit in the quiet room, letting the sunlight spill over my hands, and I would remember the months of absence, the soft invisibility, the distance. I allowed myself to feel the grief fully before letting it soften into acceptance. I realized the turning point was not instant. It was not a dramatic revelation or an abrupt reconciliation. It was the accumulation of quiet acknowledgments, the recognition of absence, and the courage to face exclusion without losing heart. Every gentle smile, every small conversation, every shared cup of tea was a step toward mending a bond that had frayed. I began to notice subtler signs of change. Armin paused mid-sentence to ask my opinion. He waited for my thoughts before deciding on small things, from which movie to watch in the evening, to what tea we would have the next morning. Even Sarah, who had seemed impenetrable, offered me glimpses of Kara's shared look, a brief question, a genuine curiosity. Each act, minor to an outsider, carried profound meaning. It was the evidence of awareness, a recognition that I had been there all along, silently enduring. The home, once heavy with subtle exclusion, began to feel lighter. The air seemed easier to breathe, the sunlight brighter, the shadows less oppressive, yet traces of the old distance remained, like faint footprints that linger after snow has melted. I understood that relationships are not repaired in an instant. They are rebuilt, slowly, brick by brick, with patience, with courage, with the quiet knowledge that love endures, even when it seems unacknowledged. By the end of the week, I felt a subtle but profound shift. I could sit at the table without feeling invisible. I could share a joke and be heard. I could exist in this home again, not merely tolerated, but seen. The experience taught me the value of small acknowledgments, of gentle recognition, and of the quiet persistence of love. I learned that turning points are often quiet, subtle, almost imperceptible. They come not as dramatic confrontations, but as moments of recognition, understanding, and courage. And I understood, finally, that endurance is not merely about survival. It is about continuing to love, to offer presence, to maintain hope, even when invisibility threatens to overwhelm the heart. As I lay down that evening, the house finally feeling like home again, I whispered softly to myself, "I am here. I have endured. I have loved. and even when unseen, love remains. That is the quiet power I carry. The days after that quiet acknowledgement felt like the first breaths after holding your head underwater for too long. There was a slow, almost imperceptible lightness in the air. I moved through the house differently now, as though my feet remembered a rhythm they had forgotten. The rooms seemed to breathe with me. Armin's presence no longer carried the polite distance of the previous months. Instead, there was a cautious openness, a willingness to connect, small as it was, but enough to remind me of the bond we had shared for decades. Even Sarah seemed to sense the change. She smiled more often, no longer with that crisp, polite formality, but with warmth that reached her eyes. Her gestures softened, the movements around the house gentler, more deliberate, less exclusive. She asked small questions, not to test me, but to invite conversation, to include me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but to me, it meant everything. I began noticing the little things that had gone unnoticed for months. Armin would pause in the kitchen, linger as I poured tea, and ask about my day. Not a cursory question, but one that waited for an answer, that invited conversation. Sometimes he would watch me as I read by the window, a faint smile playing on his lips, a quiet acknowledgement of my presence, of shared space. Sarah, too, offered small signs of recognition. She would make tea without being asked, leaving the cup beside mine. A gesture of inclusion. I realized, slowly, that reconciliation was not about grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It was in these quiet moments that felt insignificant yet carried enormous weight. Each shared cup of tea, every gentle word, each glance that conveyed understanding without speech, became threads weaving a fragile, but real, tapestry of connection. One afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Armin at the kitchen table. The sun poured through the window, casting golden patterns over the worn wood, highlighting the steam rising from our tea. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though unsure if the words were too heavy, too fragile to be carried across the table. "Mom, I've missed this," he said softly, his voice low, but sincere. I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Me too," I whispered, barely audible, letting my voice tremble just enough to reveal my relief. We talked then, not about the months of distance, not about the misunderstandings or the subtle coldness, but about small, ordinary things, the meals we liked, the books we were reading, the simplest shared memories from his childhood. The conversation was slow and careful, like water finding its way through rocks that had once blocked its flow. And yet, it was natural, flowing, returning to its channel after a long blockage. I began to understand that healing required patience, trust, warmth, and connection could not be forced. They could not be summoned with words alone. Each day offered an opportunity to show love, to offer presence without expectation, and to accept connection when it was gently offered in return. Every smile, every acknowledgement, every act of inclusion was a brick in the bridge, being rebuilt across the months of distance. Sarah and I began finding our rhythm. At first, it was tentative. She would ask for small pieces of advice in the kitchen, something simple like the correct temperature for the oven, or whether a certain spice would enhance the flavor of a dish. I answered softly, sharing my thoughts, offering guidance with patience, never pushing, never lecturing, and gradually, she began to respond differently, with openness, curiosity, and even a trace of affection that had been missing before. I noticed the subtle ways she adjusted around me. She no longer monopolized conversations with Armin or moved through the house as if I were merely a visitor. She began to speak directly to me, her questions sincere, her tone gentle. There were times she laughed at a shared joke, and instead of feeling excluded, I felt a quiet satisfaction that a space had reopened for me, that my presence was being recognized, welcomed. One evening, as I arranged flowers in a simple vase on the dining table, Armin entered the room. He stood silently, watching me for a long moment, before speaking. "You've always cared so much, Mom, even when I didn't notice," he said, voice full of warmth, tinged with the weight of months gone by. I smiled softly, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. "I've always been here," I said quietly. "I always will be." Those words lingered in the room, simple yet profound. They reminded me that love could endure even when unacknowledged, that patience could sustain bonds when they felt fragile, and that connection could be rebuilt through gentle, consistent effort. I began returning to small rituals that had once been sources of comfort and joy. I baked bread, letting the scent fill the house, offering slices to Armin and Sarah without expectation of praise. I set the table carefully for meals, arranging each plate with thought, hoping for small moments of shared conversation. Sometimes the conversation flowed naturally, sometimes awkwardly, but each time, the hope of connection was met, and that was enough. There were still moments when I would sit quietly, alone, and feel the subtle ache of the months gone by. Those memories of being unseen, of small moments of exclusion, were part of my heart, and I did not push them away. Instead, I allowed myself to sit with them, to honor them, to acknowledge their place in my life without letting them define my present. One rainy afternoon, as raindrops traced delicate patterns down the window pane, I watched Armand and Sarah laughing together in the living room. The sound, which would have once been a reminder of my exclusion, now felt like the home returning to life. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, listening to the rhythm of rain, feeling a quiet contentment that had been absent for so long. In that moment, I understood something deeply important. Healing does not happen in an instant. It does not arrive with grand gestures or sudden apologies. It unfolds slowly, in small acts of care, in quiet acknowledgments, in willingness to remain present even when invisible. Patience is a teacher that shows itself in the gentle persistence of love, in the subtle return of warmth, and in the gradual bridging of distance. I wrote in my journal that evening, love does not demand, it does not force itself, it waits, quietly, patiently, hoping for moments of recognition and warmth. And when those moments come, they are more precious than I could have imagined. Over the following weeks, I began noticing other subtle shifts. Armin started pausing mid-task to ask me questions, not because he needed answers, but because he wanted my perspective. He would sometimes walk into the room, sit beside me silently, and offer no words at all, simply allowing the presence to exist. A gesture that carried its own quiet acknowledgement. Sarah, too, found her comfort around me. She began to share stories of her childhood, of memories that had shaped her. I listened attentively, offered reflections, and sometimes shared my own recollections, creating a shared space that felt intimate and genuine. It was no longer a household divided, but a family slowly rediscovering its rhythm, its connection, its warmth. I realized that the turning point was not a singular event. It was a collection of tiny moments, delicate gestures, and unspoken understandings that gradually restored what had been broken. It was patience, endurance, and the steadfast persistence of love that rebuilt the bridge between us. Even in moments of quiet reflection, when I sat alone by the window or in my room, the ache of exclusion did not vanish entirely, but it became bearable, tempered by awareness that love and connection could return, even if slowly. I had learned that the heart could hold both grief and hope, that loneliness could coexist with the knowledge of being seen, acknowledged, and valued. The rituals of daily life became anchors in this process. Morning tea, small conversations, shared laughter over simple meals, quiet evenings spent in the same room, each moment was a thread strengthening the fragile fabric of family connection. These small acts mattered more than words, more than apologies, more than any dramatic demonstration of care. They carried a steady rhythm of presence, a reminder that love is patient, enduring, and resilient. I began noticing subtle signs of trust returning. Armin began sharing minor worries and small triumphs. He would occasionally glance at me while speaking, waiting for acknowledgement, for reaction, for shared understanding. Sarah allowed me into spaces I had been absent from, helping with tasks, planning meals, arranging the house. Even the simplest gestures became proof that we were rebuilding, carefully, deliberately, and with mutual recognition. And so, the house began to feel alive again. Not perfect, not without moments of awkwardness or residual tension, but alive. It was no longer a place where I existed on the margins, invisible, excluded. It was home. By the end of the month, I felt a quiet but profound shift. Connection had returned in subtle, enduring ways. The space between us had been bridged, not by dramatic words, but by persistent, patient love. I understood that healing is not measured in days or hours, but in the careful nurturing of trust, recognition, and shared presence. I closed the month with a final entry in my journal, a reflection on the journey we had undertaken. The turning point is rarely loud or dramatic. It is quiet, subtle, and often imperceptible. It is in the small gestures, the gentle acknowledgments, the willingness to be present even when unseen. Love, patient and enduring, has the power to heal what seemed irreparable. And in that quiet return, the heart finds its home once more. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost unremarkable from the outside. But inside the walls of our home, a subtle transformation was taking place. Every morning began in soft light, the sun spilling gently across the kitchen floor. The rhythm of the house had changed. It was no longer punctuated by polite nods or silent avoidance, but by small gestures of inclusion, moments that reminded me that I was still part of the life I had helped build. I began to notice a new rhythm emerging, one defined not by expectation, but by gentle, mutual presence. Coffee cups sat side by side on the table, steam curling upwards, carrying warmth and comfort. I would ask Armand about his plans for the day, and he would respond with more than a cursory nod or grunt. He shared snippets of work, small observations, stories of colleagues, and sometimes even frustrations. I listened, not needing to fix or advise, simply allowing him to speak and knowing that he was including me in a life I feared had moved on without me. Sarah, too, found her place in this evolving rhythm. She no longer seemed distant, as if she were threading through our home on tiptoe. Instead, she moved with ease, occasionally pausing to share small stories, offering gestures of kindness, a plate of cookies placed on the counter with a quiet smile, or a cup of tea left beside mine without a word, a silent acknowledgement of companionship. These moments, simple as they were, became the proof that reconciliation need not be dramatic to be real. I began to realize that healing did not require forcing conversations or demanding apologies. It required patience, observation, and openness to small gestures. A passing smile, a shared cup of tea, a brief touch on the arm. Each one became an act of reconciliation, quietly reinforcing the love that had always existed beneath the surface. Slowly, I saw that these gestures carried more weight than any grand apology could have. They were authentic, unpretentious, and full of meaning. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen with Sarah. She handed me a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I thought you might like these," she said, her voice quiet but sincere, offering them with a small, nervous smile. I felt warmth spread through me, a gentle surge of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very thoughtful," I replied. It was in these small moments that I felt the truest form of reconciliation. There was no need for speeches or explanations of the past. There was simply acknowledgement, respect, and shared care. These acts, humble as they were, became the glue holding our fragile, renewed bond together. Evenings began to feel different. Armand lingered after dinner, not because he was obligated, but because he wanted to. Sometimes he helped clear the table, moving with a slow attentiveness that seemed to say, "I see you here, I appreciate you." Other times, he simply sat, sharing silence with me, or recounting a story from his day. The conversations were slow, measured, patient, and deliberate. Occasionally, we revisited old memories, laughing at childhood mishaps, remembering family trips, or recounting stories of mistakes and lessons learned. These moments were not perfect, but they created a new tapestry of connection, woven not from the threads of the past, but from an understanding that love could evolve without losing its core. I also found myself letting go of old anxieties, the fears that had once consumed me. The tension of months spent apart, the silent nights filled with worry, began to loosen its grip. I learned that love is not measured by constant acknowledgement or proximity. It is measured by endurance, by the willingness to remain present, even when unseen. Each act of patience, each moment of silent support, became a testament to the depth of my feelings and the quiet resilience of the bonds we share. One evening, I noticed Armand moving slowly around the kitchen, carrying groceries. His hands brushed mine as he passed a bag, and he paused, looking at me with a soft expression. "I appreciate everything you do, Mom," he said almost hesitantly, as if uncertain how such words would land. I swallowed the lump in my throat, fighting back tears. "I'm always here, Armand," I whispered. Those words, simple and true, carried more meaning than I could ever express. It was a quiet acknowledgement of connection, a recognition of endurance, and an affirmation that love had survived the trials of distance and misunderstanding. Sarah, too, began to share her life more openly. She asked about my childhood, my family, and the lessons I had learned over the years. I answered slowly, carefully, letting her glimpse the woman behind the role of mother-in-law, woman with her own stories, her own fears, her own dreams. Over time, the barriers between us softened, replaced by empathy, understanding, and even a subtle fondness. I began to sense her trust in me, the comfort of knowing that she no longer viewed me as an intruder, but as part of the household, a presence to be respected, included, and valued. I realized that forgiveness and reconciliation are rarely dramatic. They are quiet, patient, and incremental. Each day offered new opportunities to connect, to offer care without expectation, and to accept care when it was offered. Every small gesture, cup of tea, a shared joke, a kind word was a brick in the foundation of a renewed relationship, one built not on perfection, but on enduring presence and quiet love. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the living room, I felt Armand's presence behind me. He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Mom, thank you for always being here," he said, softly, sincerely. I turned, looking into his eyes, and felt a wave of warmth and relief wash over me. "Always, Armand, always," I replied, my voice steady but full of feeling. It was in that moment that I understood something fundamental. The depth of love is measured not by recognition in the moment, but by the quiet, patient commitment to be there, to endure, and to continue caring, even when it feels unacknowledged. Those months of distance had tested us, but they had also taught us to value the small, gentle acts that sustain relationships, that weave hearts together again. I began noticing the little habits that made life richer. Armand would pause mid-conversation to ask my thoughts, not expecting a right answer, but valuing my perspective. Sarah would invite me to help with dinner preparation, sharing laughs over dropped ingredients or overcooked rice. These moments were unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, they were proof of healing. Evidence that patience and love could restore what had been fragile and broken. Even simple domestic routines became meaningful. We would sit together in the evenings, sometimes without speaking, simply sharing space. The quiet of the home, once filled with tension and distance, now carried comfort. Occasionally, Armand would recount a memory from his childhood, or Sarah would share a story from her day, and I would listen, respond, and sometimes laugh aloud. The house no longer felt like a place of careful observation, but a space of shared life. Restored gently through attention and care, I realized that love, like a garden, requires tending. Neglect does not erase it entirely, but it allows weeds distance, misunderstanding, omission to grow. The act of returning, of patiently nurturing, of offering attention without expectation, was what brought the garden back to life. I had learned that presence matters more than perfection, and patience more than immediate recognition. Even in the quiet moments of reflection, when I sat by the window watching raindrops trace delicate lines down the glass, I felt a sense of calm. The ache of the months past was still there, a soft reminder of what had been, but it no longer dominated my thoughts. Instead, I could appreciate the gentle healing unfolding before me, the slow reweaving of bonds that had seemed fragile, the quiet joy in witnessing subtle gestures of care. In the following weeks, our family rhythms settled into a gentle, enduring flow. Armand included me in small decisions, consulting me on household matters, sharing moments of pride and frustration alike. Sarah became more open, her trust in me growing, her laughter unguarded, her gestures considerate. The home felt alive again. Not perfect, but real, warm, and shared. I often wrote in my journal during these days. Love is quiet endurance. It is patience when unseen, gentleness when unnoticed, and presence when ignored. It is in small gestures, subtle acknowledgments, and unspoken care that hearts are restored. I am here. I am seen. I am loved again. The subtle transformation of our home, the slow healing of our relationships, reminded me that reconciliation is rarely loud. It does not require dramatic words or public displays. It is found in shared meals, lingering smiles, a gentle touch on the shoulder, laughter at a forgotten memory, and the willingness to continue offering love, even when the world feels distant. By the end of that month, I knew that our bonds had been renewed not by one event, but by countless quiet acts of care, patience, and understanding. The foundation of our relationships had shifted from fragile politeness to steady, enduring connection, and in that transformation, I found peace, comfort, and hope for the years ahead. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed dramatically, but because the air carried a gentle warmth I hadn't noticed before. It was the kind of warmth that comes not from the sun or a fire, but from the presence of hearts slowly finding their way back to one another. I would sit by the window in the late afternoon, a cup of tea in my hands, and watch the world outside move with its usual rhythm. Children played on the streets, neighbors exchanged greetings, Cars passed by with familiar hums, but inside, there was a quiet peace that felt earned, delicate, and real. I thought often about the months that had passed, the silent evenings, the moments of anxiety, the nights when tears fell unnoticed onto my pillow. I realized those moments were not wasted. They had taught me the depth of patience, the strength of endurance, and the quiet power of love that does not demand recognition. Every tear, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer had shaped me into someone who could love without conditions, who could endure distance without resentment, and who could accept reconciliation without haste. Armin and I did not return to exactly what we had before. That bond had changed, reshaped by life, by misunderstanding, and by time, but it had grown deeper in some ways, more resilient, more conscious. I learned that relationships are not static, they evolve, stretch, and bend, sometimes in ways that feel uncomfortable, sometimes in ways that feel painful, but they can also heal, if nurtured with care, empathy, and patience. I remember the quiet evenings when we would sit together after dinner. Armin might read a book while I tidied the kitchen, or I might write letters I sometimes sent and sometimes kept in my journals. Sarah would occasionally join, asking questions about memories, sharing small stories of her day. These moments, ordinary as they seemed, became extraordinary to me. They were the stitches mending what had been torn, the slow weaving of trust and understanding. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, I found Armand lingering in the kitchen. He offered a soft smile, one that reached his eyes, and simply said, "Thanks for always being here, Mom." I felt my heart swell with quiet emotion. I did not need grand words or dramatic gestures. That simple acknowledgement was enough. It reminded me that love is not measured in declarations, but in presence, patience, and endurance. It reminded me that even when relationships falter, when distance grows, and when misunderstanding clouds hearts, there is always hope for reconnection. I also realized the importance of forgiveness, not just of others, but of myself, for the times I had doubted, for the moments I had felt unneeded, for the fears that had kept me awake at night. I forgave myself for feeling hurt, for feeling anxious, and for needing reassurance. And in forgiving myself, I was able to fully embrace the moments of peace and joy that had returned. Life is unpredictable. People change, circumstances shift, but what remains constant, if we choose to nurture it, is love, the patient, enduring, unspoken love that withstands trials and survives absence. I learned that love does not demand perfection, nor does it require constant acknowledgement. It only requires us to remain, to be present, and to care, even in the quiet moments when no one is watching now. I often sit by the window in the late afternoon, tea in hand, and watch the world pass by. I think of Armand, of Sarah, and of the gentle peace that has settled over our home. The ache that once felt so consuming has softened into a quiet pulse, a reminder of all that we have endured, all that we have learned, and all that we continue to build together. And sometimes, when the house is especially still, I whisper softly to myself, almost like a prayer, "Love endures, love waits, love forgives, and love is always enough." I set down my cup, breathe deeply, and let the warmth of the evening wrap around me. Outside, the world continues its relentless rhythm. Inside, my heart is lighter, calmer, and full of quiet hope. I know that life will bring challenges, that there may be moments of distance or misunderstanding again. But I also know that the bonds we have nurtured through patience, endurance, and love are strong enough to survive, to heal, and to grow. In the end, I understood that motherhood, family, and love are not about control or perfection. They are about presence, about quiet care, about the willingness to hold space for someone else's heart, even when it feels fragile. They are about recognizing that love, in all its quiet, enduring forms, is the greatest gift we can offer, and the greatest gift we can receive. And so, in the soft light of the evening, with the faint hum of life outside, and the comforting presence of those I love inside, I finally feel at peace. Not the triumphant peace of a story neatly resolved, but the deep, lasting peace of a heart that has learned patience, that has endured, and that continues to love without expectation, without condition, and without fear.